All right, thank you guys for joining us again. We are going to start session 2, the first session this afternoon. And we are starting off with Ben Snyder, who is joining us for his second summer here in the CASSI program. He comes to us from Cal Poly Pomona, and he's been working for the last 2 summers with Fakhri. And he'll tell us about their project together, what happens to the cool gaseous halos of massive galaxies in dense environments.
Thanks, Gwen. I'm excited to tell you all about our research. So I'm going to start by saying what I mean by gaseous halos, also known as the circumgalactic medium, which I will refer to as the CGM. So this diagram depicts what's called the baryon cycle, which basically is a process by which gas gets recycled into and out of galaxies and their CGM. So gas flows into galaxies, it forms stars, those stars go supernova and have other forms of feedback, which sends gas back out into the CGM. And a bunch more complicated stuff happens, but basically the CGM can tell us about long-term star formation and galaxy evolution. And the CGM is roughly on the scale of a galaxy's virial radius. The CGM can also tell us about some very important questions, such as why do some galaxies stop forming stars? And in our project in particular, I'll take you through the mystery of cool gas around quiescent galaxies. So like I mentioned, cool gas in the CGM is crucial to star formation. But the mystery is, as you can see in this figure, there is the covering fraction of cool gas on the y-axis and the mass of the galaxy on the x-axis. The mystery is that even in galaxies which aren't forming stars, passive luminous red galaxies, we still see cool gas that indicates star formation. So why isn't it actually really leading to star formation? And although this is much less than what we see in star-forming galaxies, it's still significant and much more than we would expect. And so our project, our little niche in this bigger problem, is trying to figure out if galaxy environment could play a role. So how do we actually study the circumgalactic medium through observation? The problem is that gas in the CGM is very faint, and so ideally we need a bright background source to study it in absorption. And so we use quasars, active galactic nuclei that are so bright that they can outshine the entire rest of the stars in their host galaxy. Better yet, we use, in this project, quadruply lensed quasars. So how this works is that there's a background quasar, a massive galaxy in the foreground, and the light from that quasar gets gravitationally lensed by the massive galaxy. And in the most special of circumstances, this leads to 4 images of the same quasar on our telescope. And it'll be important to keep in mind as we go through that the quasar is way in the background. It's not physically related to this galaxy, but what's important is that it shines a light behind, around it, so we can see the gas that surrounds that galaxy. And so our sample of massive galaxies that we're studying are in redshift between redshift 0.45 and 0.75, and we'll be probing the very inner CGM of those galaxies because we have these lensing effects happening. So 3 of those 4 galaxies are gravitational lenses for background quasars themselves. You can see them here. Note the physical scales here are very, it's a very inner CGM. And then we also found during later analysis that this galaxy qualifies as a massive non-star forming galaxy. And it just luckily happens to be very close to these quasar sightlines as well. So we can use that as a sort of bonus galaxy to study the inner CGM. So I mentioned that the project is about relating environment to the CGM. So how do we characterize these galaxies in environments? We use MUs, which is an integral field spectrograph. And the advantages of that is that we end up with a data cube. So not just a single spectrum, not just in images, but really the best of both worlds. We get a spectrum for each 2D pixel on the image. And so that means that our sample, when we go looking for neighboring galaxies, we're not biased by what other observers thought was most important to put a slit mask on. We can look for them in the entire field just based on the sensitivity of MUSE. And so what we do with this MUSE data is, like I just mentioned, we identify neighboring galaxies. We find their redshifts using principal component analysis that I wrote custom code for, and group those and use that to group galaxies. And then we characterize them based on spectral indices, their stellar population age, and star formation rates. So this is an example of spectra from MUSE. This is grouped into 4 galaxies that are likely physical related. One of them is one of the lenses. And you can sort of get an idea of the spectral resolution here. I've labeled some prominent spectral features as well. So I mentioned stellar population age and star formation rate. So more specifically, the way that we estimate those is, for one, using the D4000 index. So like Ella mentioned earlier, there is a break that happens at 4,000 angstroms. And for older galaxies, that break is going to be bigger than for younger galaxies. And then we also use, as a separate measure, the hydrogen delta line, which is star formation, which is sensitive to star formation within the last billion years or so. And using this plot from Kaufman 2003, we can combine those two measurements and estimate the stellar population ages. And for a pretty much instantaneous star formation rate, we use the oxygen 2 line as an indicator. So now I'm going to take you through a couple of extremes in what we found in these massive galaxies in terms of environment. So this galaxy, you can see I've labeled, here's the lens, and 3 redshifts color-coded that we think are physically related to this galaxy. So this one we would call a poor group environment, because we were able to find 3 neighbors within about 500 projected kiloparsecs. And you can see that on physical scales. Notice that the quasar sightlines are really, really close to that lensing galaxy. And the stellar population age is somewhat intermediate, between 100 million and 1 billion years old. And on the other hand, this was our most dense field. This lens has about 35 neighbors. And so that's really more of a cluster environment. And you can see that its neighboring galaxies are older on average, which is typical of a cluster environment. Okay, so now that we've looked a bit at environment, how do we actually search for the gas, the cool gas in the CGM? We use quasar spectra taken from the Magellan telescope and the Mike high-resolution Eschel spectrograph. So this is an example of a plot that we make to to search for gas. And so you can see on the right here, we have the 4 sightlines of the same quasar, and those correspond to the columns here. So what we do is, once we know the redshifts of these galaxies, we can put the quasar spectra in the rest frame of those galaxies and look for these specific transitions. The magnesium-2 doublet, which I've shown here, is the most sensitive tracer of the cool gas that we care about. So for this example, we detect cool gas in the A2 sightline and none of the others. And we can use that to estimate something called covering fraction, which is essentially just the fraction of the projected area within a given radius that is covered by gas. And another thing that we can tell with plots like these is column density. So this model that I've shown here is called a Voigt profile. And using VPFit, a software, we can, the Voigt profile can spit out a column density. What is a column density? It quantifies the amount of gas along a given sightline when we do detect it. So you can think of a long column, 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, and extending from the observer to the quasar. And the column density would be the number of atoms in that column. Now, of course, it doesn't extend that far for our purposes because we're only looking nearby the lensing galaxy, or the massive galaxy that we've put in the rest frame. So once we have all that with the environment and we've looked at the quasar spectra to find gas, what do we actually find? So here I have the covering fraction, which I mentioned earlier, plotted against the number of known neighbors. So we have the 4 galaxies that I mentioned in our sample, as well as 2 from Fakhri's previous work. So the number of known neighbors is a way to quantify the environment density. And we've chosen a threshold of about 500 kiloparsecs because that's the typical size of a dark matter halo for massive galaxies. And then similarly, I have another plot like this, but with column density. So a lot of these are upper limits because we didn't have a lot of detections. But when you take these together, what you'll notice is that in denser environments, we see less gas and we find it in fewer places. So with that in mind, I'll return to the question I posed at the beginning. What happens to the cool gaseous halos of massive galaxies in dense environments? So we think that galaxy interactions may strip gas from the inner CGM and redistribute it to large distances in the outer CGM, which would explain why we're not able to detect it in the inner CGM. And we also think that galaxy interactions may be heating and ionizing the gas, and so we wouldn't be able to detect it in the cool phase with things like magnesium-2. So for future work, I'm going to be looking at new MUSE data for old systems, particularly the 2 galaxies in Fakhri's previous work that I showed on that plot. Their new MUSE data has been available, so we'll be able to take a closer look at the environment and see if we missed any neighboring galaxies that could potentially recontextualize our findings. And then after that, we will be publishing a paper soon, so that's always very exciting. And that's all that I have. I'm happy to answer questions at this point.
Great, questions for Ben?
So could you go back to one of the first slides? It had a schematic of the object in the foreground, the background, and then the observer.
This one?
Yes. So based on the distance, based on the, well, I guess based on the distance of the 4 different lights that the observer has seen of the quasar around the galaxy in the foreground, based on the distances of those with the quasar, with the galaxy, what can you tell? So in other words, how far away the dots are in relation to the galaxy, what does that tell you, if anything?
So do you mean like when you get the image on the telescope, when you're looking at the image, how far in just projected distance, how far this is from the 4 sightlines?
How far those 4 are from the set?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Physically, I don't know the details. You could probably do something to determine something about the quasar itself. But for my project, we don't really care about the physical properties of the quasar. All we care about is that it's really bright. And so we're just basically happy to see that these are very close to this galaxy and saying, yes, we can we have this really bright light that's really nearby to this galaxy, so we can probe the very inner CGM of it.
Yeah, so here we see like 4 projections of like the same quasar. Is this like the best case scenario, or can there be more projections?
As far as I understand, this is the best case scenario. There are also double lenses that are a bit more common, but overall these configurations are very rare. I think there are less than 100 quadruple lenses that we've been able to observe.
Other questions for Ben?
Thank you so much. This is very exciting work. So I have some question about the introduction. So first, you showed a spectrum with a jump at the 4,000 angstrom.
Oh, yeah.
So could you explain more about what's causing this jump, and what does it why does it tell us the stellar population age?
Sure. So in very old galaxies, so I'm trying to make sure I get this right. Basically, it comes from the fact that there's a high density of spectral lines near this, and I don't want to get this wrong, so I can't remember if it comes from the younger galaxies pushing this side up, or absorption in the older galaxies pushing this side down. But basically, the light from older galaxies will be redder in relation to 4,000 angstroms, and so the jump will be bigger as you go from blue to red, as opposed to younger galaxies.
All right, we should probably move on, but let's thank Ben.